They murdered so many Hereros. They tortured and slaughtered so many men and women of that nation that until as recently as the 1940s, Herero women were still so traumatized by what had happened that they were not producing any young at all. But in spite of the hideous genocide committed by General Van Trotha, in spite of the multiple murders, the Herero people clung to the Christian faith. Why? Exactly why? I now come to my people, the Zulus. When King Dingaan murdered the Voortrekker leader Piet Retief, the act was watched by Reverend Owen and Reverend Halstead from their mission station, which was built on a hill overlooking King Dingaan's great village. Halstead and Owen, unharmed by Dingaan, decided to flee from the place after that. And Dingaan was deeply sorrowed that his favorite preachers had decided to leave him. And King Cetshwayo, the warrior king who won the Battle of Isandlwane in 1875 or thereabouts, never harmed missionaries. And a king who followed Cetshwayo, King Dinizulu, who was brutally tortured by the English, had a great friend in Bishop Colenso, a Christian bishop, and his daughters, one of whom was called Mary. Although he had suffered so much at the hands of the British authorities, King Dinizulu never abandoned his white Christian friends. They comforted him, and he depended desperately upon them and their Bible in his darkest hours.
Would the same basic story, Credo, be true of how the British or the Illuminati based in Britain took over Australia too?
Yes, I have found exactly the same stories. The Aborigines, like Africans, were deliberately softened up long before they were colonized by the white people. There were men, mysterious men, who often posed as gods, who undermined the will of the Aborigines to resist the encroachment of the colonialists.
It's also interesting that Captain Cook, who is the guy who's supposed to have, quote, discovered Australia, New Zealand, that area of the world,
yes,
was actually sponsored and funded and in fact controlled by the Royal Society, which was a Freemasonic and is a Freemasonic science operation based in London.
Yes, sir. Let me show you another interesting thing. There is a man I have been investigating in vain for over 40 years now. A man who committed acts of hideous genocide upon our people here in South Africa. A man of whom historians are so fond that he is practically a white cow whom you may not dare to point a finger at. If you see me sitting in front of you, a man who was demonized over 30 years ago by the South African news media, it was because I asked questions about this white man, Sir George Grey. Who was Sir George Grey? What was he? Was he a Freemason? Was he an Illuminati? How is it that this Sir George Grey, who is the actual founder of the most oppressive laws that British colonialism ever settled our people with, apartheid was laid down by Sir George Grey. The carrying of identity papers was laid down by Sir George Grey in the 1850s, in the last century. And Sir George Grey dealt our kings a mortal blow. But let me first tell you, this man was sent from London to quell a Maori rebellion in New Zealand, which had defeated the efforts of military men. The Maori were unstoppable. Their rebellion was blazing like a bushfire through New Zealand. But when George Grey was sent to New Zealand, he managed to quell this rebellion with very, very little loss of life. What did George Grey do? I have never been able to find a book which tells me exactly what did George Grey do in New Zealand in order to pacify the Maoris who had beaten the efforts of the British soldiers. Because that same George Grey was brought from New Zealand to South Africa in order to quell a great rebellion by the Xhosa people. And George Grey used outright trickery in order to force the Xhosa people to actually destroy themselves. George Grey deliberately and cold-bloodedly tricked the Xhosa people into slaughtering their own cattle, burning their own crops. It is one of the saddest stories of our country's blood-drenched history. And almost overnight, George Grey reduced the Xhosa people of the Eastern Cape into a nation of dying skeletal starvelings. Because after George Grey had manipulated the Xhosas with raw trickery into destroying their crops, destroying their cattle, he practically had them on the plate. Hunger, raw hunger and starvation achieved what military might had failed to achieve after many, many embattled decades. George Grey was a psychologist par excellence. George Grey was a trickster who knew the native races, and he knew how to exploit their beliefs to bring about their own destruction. Let me show you what Grey did. One day, when great tension was boiling up in the Cape, and when the colonialists were threatened by yet another border war between themselves and the Xhosa people,